Hello and thanks for watching this Life Solved video. I'm Robyn Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers who are sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. Now this is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. In this episode, we take a look at how social media is increasingly a breeding ground for incel content. Incel being a shortened term for involuntary celibate. I'm joined by Solea, PhD researcher and teaching fellow, alongside Lisa Sugiura, Associate Professor in Cybercrime and Gender in the School of Criminology and Justice here at the University of Portsmouth. Anda was a lead author of a recent study that discovered how incels aren't simply hiding in the shadows of the internet. They're surprisingly prominent on the likes of the social media video app, TikTok. And Lisa is the author of the Incel Rebellion. So thank you very much for joining me today. And before we get started, I just want to pay attention to where we are. Now, this isn't a styling choice or something we've decided to just paint the whole room black. We're actually in a dark room here at the University of Portsmouth. And this is where students come to study criminology. And upstairs we've got some really fantastic crime scene simulation spaces. So if you are interested in anything to do with crime scenes, it's definitely worth checking that out. And while a lot of crimes are obviously in the physical realm, we're talking about virtual crime today. So, perfect space. Let's start right from the basics then. The area of criminology, it's quite broad, but what drew you to this area of research, if we start with yourself?
So I started being interested in studying the internet and internet communities because as a young person, I was using, social media, in particular YouTube, quite a lot. So I come from quite a neglectful and violent background. So having access to internet and to people to interact with and sort of exchange similar experiences has been very useful for my development. And I found, belonging and community there. But then as the years progressed, I realized that this is not the experience that everybody else has. So a lot of groups, particularly minorities, whether they are gender minorities or the LGBTQ+, or, ethnicities, different ethnicities, they experience a lot of hate and abuse online. And when, you would have young people trying to find community online and sort of escape their home environment, they want to go online. But then rather than having my experience, they experience a lot of additional harms and abuse. So that would be, something that made me interested in this, particularly looking at what type of abuse we have online and what can be done to sort of stop and limit this to enable other young people to use social media in a positive way.
So I brought up in kind of the internet generation where you had things like MySpace and stuff, if anyone remembers that. MySpace, which were great for building on those communities, but they were also kind of bullying spaces as well. There were incidents of people saying some pretty horrible things to friends at school and stuff online. So yeah, I suppose you can either have a really good experience or a really bad one, or a mix of both. And what about yourself, Lisa?
So I've been working in the field of cybercrime for nearly 13 years, focusing more on the human dimensions of cybercrime and cybersecurity. So looking at areas like online deviance, how are people using technology to abuse and misuse. And initially, my PhD wasn't anything to do with what I do now in regards to sort of looking at how sexual violence is facilitated online and sort of gendered issues. It was actually about online pharmaceutical purchasing. Still on deviance. But whilst I was studying that particular topic, I think it was around about 2013, 2014, there were so many different events that made me question my values, my worldview, and to really develop my passions in looking at this sort of more gendered perspectives online. So there was the incident Gamergate, where you had female journalists in the gaming industry that were being abused and they were receiving rape and death threats. You had the iCloud hack of various celebrities, and their intimate images were released, obviously without the consent, and the trauma that followed that. And then you also had the Isla Vista attack, which was one of the first mass killings associated with the incel community. So I started developing that interest, looking more at sort of misogynistic activity online and hate speech and inequalities, and how certain persons from marginalised communities are more targeted online, and started working then on a particular project looking at the language of cybersexism in 2017. And it was from there that I really sort of started delving more into sort of online misogyny, and in particular the involuntary celibate community, in particular misogynistic incels.
So it was more a series of events that really caught your attention and you thought, well, there's clearly a pattern emerging with the developing technology. And obviously that's where we come on to incels and the community of incels. So why should we be concerned about this particular group of people?
Right, so first it would be useful to define incels. So incels are an online subculture of men that describe themselves as unable to have sexual or romantic relationships. And so they have a very deterministic outlook in life. They believe that your looks, and particularly your attractiveness, determines whether you are going to find a partner or not. And incels define themselves as very unattractive and very much at the bottom of this hierarchy. And they blame women for their lack of sexual and romantic interactions. As Lisa has mentioned earlier, so the incel subculture, and particularly members that are identified as incels, have engaged in several mass shooting and mass casualty events. So we have the Isla Vista killings in 2014, but also the Plymouth shootings in 2021 here in England. But then it is important to recognize that while these events are, extremist and terrible, incels also engage in day-to-day cyber violence. For example, they go online and harass women, they engage in a lot of trolling, and they've been associated with other things such as hate speech directed towards women, sexual and physical threats. And then particularly when we talk about mainstream social media and video sharing platforms such as TikTok, it becomes more dangerous when it was previously taught, and particularly because previous research was looking at the incel community on 4chan, incel.is, and some subreddits. It was thought that they are just, on some of these niche platforms, whereas you need to know what an incel is, and you need to want to engage with the community to see their content. But now to our study on TikTok, which is the first study that has examined the incel community on TikTok, we sort of demonstrated through an analysis of accounts and videos that videos promoting the incel ideology, as well as their memes and linguistic tropes, are existent on TikTok, and they are being spread to wider audiences. So this is particularly concerning because of the content that they share. So often in these videos they promote misogyny, sexism, and they portray women in very derogatory ways. So they just go forward with these gender stereotypes that are already present within society, but they are further reinforced. But then we need to think about the role mainstream social media platforms play in this, right? Because it's on TikTok where you have a wider audience, also heterogeneous audience. So there will be members of the public who might not know what an incel is, they might not know this ideology, but they might agree with it when they see it. And then also obviously TikTok is very much popular with younger audiences, young men and women, and it's very, it goes viral, easy to share, and it links with, other communities as well.
So we'll get to TikTok in a minute, but I just again want to focus on incels as a community or group of people. This isn't something that's just begun on the internet. Incels and the attitudes of, misogyny and stuff, there's a history to that. Lisa, where does this sort of play into it?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point to make, is that incels don't exist in a vacuum. I think it's problematic to kind of treat them as something spectacular or unique, because that distracts from wider societal misogyny and the everyday experiences that women have, often at the hands of men. And we're talking about male violence, we're talking about misogyny, we're talking about discrimination, sexism. And of course, that predates the incel community, it predates the technology. But what happens is it's being reinforced and exacerbated by digital technologies. And if we look at incels in particular, that kind of ideology where men present themselves as the victims, that they need to kind of fight back for their very survival. Again, that is not anything particularly novel or contemporary. If we look back to the sort of 1970s with the men's rights movements that sort of developed alongside second wave feminism, and in fact were actually allies of second wave feminism, completely recognised the harmful effects of patriarchal systems to everybody, irrespective of gender. But what happened was a splintering where some men that were dissatisfied within the original men's rights movement sort of came away and became very much about anti-feminism and taken away from women's gains and women's rights. And those sorts of attitudes have never gone away, they've continued to exist. And what's happened is where we see, or where society seems to be progressive on the surface, is that underground this resentment has continued to simmer away. And where you then have technology and the internet and all the affordances that come with being online, like the reach and the engagement and being able to interact with people who ordinarily couldn't, and you get the audience and you get to disseminate your ideas in new and what seems like novel ways, that is the perfect storm, where it's been able to then breed these new, or what seems like these sort of new communities. But as And in fact, actually, it's the same ideology underpinning it all.
And what you said about, Ander, about TikTok in particular being a bit of a cause of concern is that people may not go out seeking these attitudes or these ideas like you would do on other platforms like Reddit, or if you were to physically go along to a meeting of people that believed in the same things as you. You're getting them fed to you by usually AI or something like that, that filters out content I think you might be interested in. And as soon as you click on that and you watch it, you're probably likely to get more of it just because of how these platforms work. And that's worrying in itself, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And we see on TikTok that, you might have a person that goes on there and tries to look at advice on dating, which might not necessarily be misogynistic. Like, there are different types of people that do give like genuine advice about dating. But then slowly and surely you get to see, pickup artists who are a lot more misogynistic in their style. And then you could get, videos related to the incel ideology, which is on TikTok particularly, they focus a lot on looks and also on the social hierarchy and demonstrating that women are not attracted to like short men or particular types of men that don't have a well-defined jaw. And also within TikTok, you have these built-in connections. So for example, content creators can create content together. So it's called like stitching. So you take the content of a person and then you redo it in your own way. Then you also have hashtags that are used and are disseminated to many people. For example, in some of my TikTok sample, I have these content creators that put the hashtag for you page, men, hashtag women. So you would say they're inconspicuous, right? They're not related to the incel ideologies, but they are put there to draw, wider audiences to the particular video and to gain views and an audience.
And social media platforms, they always argue that they're against hate speech, and they have huge efforts in order to reduce the amount of hate speech that they find that people can find on their platforms. But I suppose there are ways around that. And did you find that in your study that incel communities have worked out ways of getting around the system?
Yes, so that's very much so. So for example, taking the case of TikTok, if you look for the term incel, this term is banned, and TikTok does tell you that this is associated with a hateful community. However, if you know a little bit more about the incel community, you don't need to know much, just know that they subscribe to the black pill ideology. You could search for the term black pill, and you can spell it differently, so it doesn't need to be spelled correctly. And then you get a lot of hashtags that are related to the black pill, but are spelled in such ways that they escape content moderation to this. So I searched for this hashtag and I found a lot of accounts and a lot of videos posted under this. So you could say that, the platform has tried to ban incels because you can't search for incel, but you can search for the black pill ideology.
It's so interesting because, you assume that you're protected when you give a certain level of trust to the social media companies when you go onto these platforms. But it is a huge undertaking, especially because the amount of people that use platforms like TikTok, the range of ages, how is it even possible to be able to filter through all that content and really offer that level of protection that you expect? I mean, your work, Lisa, do you find that these people who partake in, incel behaviour, do they really understand how severe that is?
I mean, I suppose it's about, what do we mean by incel behaviour as well? As I said, I think, we need to be kind of careful about treating it as something, particularly novel. What we're talking about is misogyny or male supremacism, that belief that men are, should be in a dominant position over women. Women should be subservient, and they want to change society to obviously get back to that sort of romanticized ideal for them. But yeah, in terms of that sort of responsibility and what we can do about it, obviously what we're up against is the fact that this is a whole societal problem. This isn't just contained to online. What we're seeing is that those ideologies, which may seem more extreme, more overt online, but they're being reinforced and validated in offline, and often by people with a platform in the mainstream media as well. The former President of the United States, who infamously said something about cats, which I'm not going to repeat here. There was obviously there was no punishment for that. That was, he was still able to take his presidency even after that came out. So what does that do? That just validates the fact that women are able to be objectified and spoken about in this way. So that's the problem we're up against, is that the approach cannot just be about technology. It has to involve education, has to involve policy, has to involve a cultural shift as well, which of course isn't something that can just happen overnight.
I suppose it's that argument as well that seems to always crop up, including in Donald Trump's case, is free speech and a right to have an opinion. where do you draw the line, and why is free speech getting mucked up into the whole argument?
Okay, so whilst I am certainly not in favour of a completely controlled internet or anything like that, and certainly, just handing over all our civil rights to, to governments, we really have to unpack what we mean by freedom of speech here as well. Freedom of speech does not mean the freedom to abuse. It is not a license to say absolutely anything you like without thinking about the harm it's going to have on people. And also thinking about if we just allow anybody to say anything they like, well, whose privileges are being prioritised as well? Because what you find is that the people who are already most marginalised in our communities, they continue to be silenced. And that's what's happening online. Technology is reproducing those inequalities. So it's about recognising the fact that, yes, we have certain protections and they should be our civil rights, but it also isn't a just complete, freedom to do whatever you like, and certainly not to abuse.
I think it's really interesting what you said about not trivialising incels and misogyny, because I imagine there are probably people on TikTok or other platforms who maybe engage in misogyny and incel, content, and they think, it doesn't count because it's not in person. Did you find that some of the content maybe, or some of the attitudes towards it, aren't as strong as maybe if it was an in-person behaviour or a meeting?
Yeah, so I think that relates also a lot to trolling online. So where, you are anonymous and you also are not, you don't know the victim and you can't see their suffering, right? So then you feel more free to say whatever you want to say and behave in ways that you would not count as, acceptable within day-to-day, everyday spaces in when somebody's in front of you. So you definitely see a lot of that. And then I think particularly because of the way, the incel content on TikTok is distributed and created, it makes it sound more like implicit, so it doesn't sound as harmful. So within our paper, we analyzed these TikTok accounts and videos, and we realized that, again, because of the platform moderation, they cannot be so explicit, so they cannot say, kill this person or, worse things, but they can express their content through more covert language. So, for example, we found that on TikTok, incels use pseudoscientific evidence to further their claims. So they would, for example, present a graph that it's about the height of men, and the graph has like a normal distribution, right? And the narrator is very confident, and he says that this is, a real study, and that, for example, if you are 5'10", 15% of women will reject you. So it's all about men and their heights. And then he argues that if you're 5'4", then 90% of women will reject you and you'll have no chance to ever find a partner, right? So he's very confident in what he's saying, and he's using this graph, which it doesn't have any source, so you don't know, what research has been done, where does it come from, is it even real, is it just a graph purely drawn in Excel and it has like no scientific background? But then a lot of people within the comment section, they agree with this graph. They're like, see, he provides evidence, and it just shows that women are, just thinking about looks, they don't care about personalities, they are just very shallow, and it just, perpetuates these gender beliefs that women just care about looks.
So it's basically just selling fiction or misinformation as fact and being clever in the way that you package it. It's fraud, isn't it, at the end of the day? And as a consumer of media or consumer of social media, I suppose it's noticing these irregularities in what they're seeing. Like you said, that there's no research that's been cited whatsoever. So how can you be better, how can you better prepare yourself and people that children, etc., against this harmful information online?
Well, I think if you're a parent and you were worried about your children sort of accessing this content, which unfortunately the odds are they will, it's readily available. It's about having open conversations in a non-judgmental way. The inclination might be to try and shut it down and say, this is discriminatory, it's abusive or whatever, but that's probably not the best way to engage. It's about hearing why people are watching it, what they think about it, and then unpacking some of that pseudoscientific nature that's involved in it. Ask for, what's the evidence for that? Where's the facts? It's about developing critical thinking, being able to kind of question, mis and disinformation online. And also about values, about your world values, just kind of think, well, do you really think women are evil? Do you really think women and persons who do not fit the the hegemonic ideal norm, white, able-bodied, cis, and all of that. I do think that they have got right to be better and more privileged than other people. So it's like I say, having those healthy, proactive discussions as well, I think.
So we've covered, TikTok and social media platforms like Instagram and things like that, but YouTube seems to be a platform that we need to keep our eye on as well. Why is that?
So for my PhD research, I look at cross-platforms. So I look at TikTok and also YouTube Shorts. So kind of similar to TikTok, I look at these YouTube Shorts because they are like short videos, they're easy to disseminate, and they attract large audiences. And you have also this cross-platform posting. So in my sample, I have a lot of videos from TikTok that are posted on YouTube and the other way around. And then from my preliminary findings, we are still writing a paper on YouTube. So we have analyzed, we have 5 accounts, 400 videos of these accounts, as well as, pretty large comment sections. We see that the content moderation is actually even worse on YouTube. So for example, on YouTube, you can search for the term incel, like it's not banned. And you can see that the content creators on YouTube are a lot more prolific. So some of the accounts that I have in my sample, they have been on YouTube posting incel content for the last 3 to 4 years. And they have hundreds and hundreds of videos and they have not been taken down. And just to provide a comparison, the accounts I have on TikTok, they are around 1.5 years old, and they usually don't have that many videos. So oftentimes you would see that new accounts are created, they have 5 videos and then they get taken down on TikTok, while some are more long-standing. But on YouTube, it's been going for years and they are not really regulating it in any way. And then another interesting aspect of YouTube, it seems that the followers of these particular accounts are a lot more engaged with the accounts creators than the ones on TikTok. So they follow the content on these YouTube channels, they engage with them, they ask for more content, and they discuss very, let's say, like theoretical incel debates, right? Sort of quite similar debates that you would see on 4chan or on Incel.is. They really question the theories, and they use specific terms to describe women. And this goes again in that implicity or, covered language. For example, on YouTube, some commenters refer to women as a 304. And this is a derogatory term to refer to promiscuous women as well as sex workers. So they just say this 304 does this and that. And obviously, if you look at content moderation, then, if you have like AI looking at it, they are not going to recognize this number as being something derogatory towards women, but this is what's being used to sort of escape this moderation on YouTube.
It's very dehumanizing text and phrases and stuff. For you to have to sit through and sift through that, I give you major props. But you said about prolific accounts, it'd be difficult for us to talk about misogyny and incels without mentioning Andrew Tate. So if you haven't heard of Andrew Tate, how about we just start with a bit of a background on him, keep it brief because he doesn't need more attention than he already has.
No, he really doesn't. But yes, so he's a former champion kickboxer who was a Big Brother UK contestant who got removed early from the house because videos surfaced of him beating a former female partner of his. Since then, he has managed to commodify his misogynistic and violent behaviour. To the extent that he became one of the most Googled people in the world a few years ago. He has many shady businesses which are in effect either sex trafficking or pyramid schemes. I mean, I should say alleged sex trafficking. Although no, he was prosecuted. He was prosecuted in Romania, so we can say that actually. But yeah, what he's essentially done is made a business out of conning vulnerable men into believing that they need to somehow follow this alpha model of what it is to be a man.
But again, this is not a new thing. There are examples throughout history of people following an alpha man or what's considered an alpha man. And it kind of plays in a little bit to what you said, Andrew, at the start about you found a community on YouTube or on social media that really supported you through some quite dark times. And I suppose with incels and someone like Andrew Tate, the reason why people gravitate, because he's giving them an out or potentially a group of people that they can feel like a family with.
Yeah, and that's what he's done in creating his communities, and he's had Hustlers University and now Real World, to draw attention to those things as well, which he's trying to present it in that sort of valid light. And it really does sort of present that appeal that, we love you, I love you, no one else loves you, society's left you behind. And in effect, that's what he has done. He has capitalized on this perfect storm of three things. One is the fact that, yes, young men in particular do have real anxieties and vulnerabilities. Today, it's really hard. It's, the socioeconomic pressures. There's lots of issues, but that doesn't mean that it's okay to blame women and to completely take the victim label and forget about sort of things like privilege and things, and also just to sort of espouse hatred. And then that's the second thing, the fact that misogyny continues to be so prolific in our societies that it is selling for some reason. So you've got vulnerabilities, you've got misogyny, and then also you've got the misinformation, and you've got the ability to sort of capitalize on this rhetoric online where it's presented in this way that seems valid, as Andy's been saying about that pseudoscientific appeal as well. So what he's done is he's taken all of that and created this brand, and that's often his sort of excuse as well, that, I'm not, I'm just a character, so I can't be held responsible if there is any sort of hatred, which he often denies anyway. He says that he's not a misogynist, and that the people that interpret that are completely fabricating it and misunderstanding him as well. So he's trying to use that kind of excuse, but this is what he's done. He's essentially, it's all about profit. It is all about exploitation of predominantly men, but obviously at women's expense.
Yeah, I have often heard him talk about how he loves women. I just feel like he needs to reevaluate that phrase because he's
so if
wrong.
I may add, so these issues are also like self-reinforcing. So you can think as you say, like a vulnerable young man, right, that looks online for advice. He finds the advice of, pick-up artists or manosphere people such as Andrew Tate. They sort of try their advice, whether it's getting to be more confident or working out and having muscles or, doing some shady business to have money, but they still don't get to be successful with women. So then they start being frustrated and angry that these measures have not worked. But rather than being, Andrew Tate and people like him are the problem from reinforcing these masculine, tropes, they are angry at women for not falling for these tactics.
And is that the risk of where it would go from trolling or posting something online that's misogynistic to maybe real life, issues, or using that, or putting people at risk outside of just the internet space?
Well, I don't think we should overlook the fact that 1 in 4 women in the UK is a victim of domestic abuse. So all of these tropes, all of these narratives that are being espoused about controlling your woman, that you should be coercive. To be a real man, you have to subjugate women. I mean, that message is obviously going out to people that are already perpetrators as well. So it's just reinforcing and validating their everyday activity. And we know that these attitudes about inequality and that women are somehow seen as lesser to men, that is a key driver of gender-based violence. So we can't kind of forget that impact.
I suppose it's also important to remember that it's not just young men or men generally that are absorbing this content. It's also women too. So devaluing themselves and their attitudes about what it is to be a woman are also changing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems really uncomfortable, but there are female followers of Andrew Tate. Now, cynical me does sort of question some of the ones that are more in the public eye, if they are seeing an opportunity to capitalise on as well, so jumping on the bandwagon. And we do get women that sort of link with these extremist ideologies, in all sorts of areas as well. So it's not uncommon, but certainly, the fact that all of us grow up in the same society, in a patriarchal society where we're told that there's gender inequality. So, of course, why would women therefore be inescapable to that? Going to internalise it as well.
And we spoke about consumers being more critical when it comes to social media, YouTube, or just generally. It's always good to be a critical consumer, even of news. But what else could be done in order to better regulate this sort of behaviour online?
Well, we've just got the Online Safety Act. It has just been made into legislation. So I was part of a consortium that was campaigning to get violence against women and girls explicitly mentioned in that legislation because it was completely overlooked. It's actually recognising that many online harms are gendered. It is the fact that women and persons from marginalised communities are targeted by virtue of being just who they are, their identities. And so for the 4 years that legislation was going in and out of Parliament and committees and things. It was just saying, we just absolutely need this written so the platforms will have an accountability, a responsibility to women, girls and marginalised persons. It was a couple of months ago, actually, women and girls are now in there. I think it's about 4 times they're mentioned in there. It's not the code of, we wanted a violence against women and girls code of conduct. It's not quite there, but the fact that the law has specifically mentioned women and girls. It's obviously a step in the right direction. Ofcom now need to develop guidance for social media companies to follow, so that is all great. But as I mentioned earlier, this is an all society problem, so it needs an all societal response. We can't just legislate out misogyny. We can't engineer out misogyny with the tech either. We can educate, but we can't just educate if obviously it's being allowed elsewhere. So it's from all areas. And as I said, we are talking about a cultural shift. So, this could take a generation, which, I'm quite optimistic for, because I do think the fact we're having these discussions is a really positive thing. We are making inroads into laws, but it's, I think it's a multi-stakeholder response.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again for talking with me today. It's been really interesting and hopefully informative. The word incel might be a relatively new term to you, but the issues surrounding incels online are growing at speed. As we've heard, a combination of regulation and education is needed to keep our communities safe, and we should all have our eyes open when it comes to protect the vulnerable from falling down an internet rabbit hole that ultimately will put themselves and others around them at risk. If you'd like to listen to our full episode of Life Solved, where we explore how the likes of TikTok can be a breeding ground for incel content, then head to the University of Portsmouth website or download it on your favourite podcast app now. You can click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research to find out more about the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice as well. Next time, we ask what powers do protesters have and what it means for democracy as governments across the world tighten up free speech laws. See you then.